So hello to everyone in all of your various time zones. I'd like to start us off today with just doing a little summary by way of reminder of where we were yesterday. So what is it that we learned yesterday? If I were to summarize most briefly and in the most general way, I would say that yesterday affirmed that view matters. We're living in an era where it seems that there are constant efforts to understand the many challenges, disasters, and heartbreaking horrors as having isolated, individually contained causes. Disastrous and enormous fires in the Americas are blamed on faulty power lines or errors in Forest Service controlled burns. Horrific mass shootings in so-called developed countries are attributed to deranged individuals operating alone with vague and usually mistaken reference to mental illness. An aggressive and murderous invasion of one sovereign nation in Europe by another is described as reflecting a leader's lust for power, blood, and sand. Yet in each of yesterday's talks and discussion comments, we heard several arguments for such individual-centered views as inadequate and distorting. From rejections of reductive individualism and emphasis upon the social dimension of all life, to an alternative dialectical framework expressing an appreciation of continuously changing processes, of semi-closed, circularly interactive dynamic systems characterized by complex structured coupling. Living and the world within the enactive approach are viewed as interactively sense-making, as quote, restless, precarious, and therefore necessarily impermanent, never static. The organism is seen as both shaped by interactions with the world and interdependently giving rise to the world, laying down a path in walking. A complex circularity between life, mind, environment, community, such that any conceptual separation of self and world seems deeply and mistakenly illusory, though in dissolving barriers, difference is not erased. This view, given by the enactive framework, going back to its initial formulation, has both implicit and explicit relationships to Buddhist perspectives, something we'll hear much more about this afternoon, particularly regarding impermanence, not self, and interdependent co-arising. So there are multiple implications of this convergence, as well, I think importantly, as some areas of divergence of these views. For example, what philosopher Kyle White called an epistemology of coordination, emphasizing moral social bonds at the center of an emergent knowing of the world. With various so-called crises of our era as actually manifestations of long-standing, ongoing disruptions of social relationships. How do we individually and collectively come to appreciate the reality and implications of this socially embedded enactive view? It may depend more upon what we do than what we can explicitly conceptualize and verbally express. More involving of interdependent processes throughout the entire body, not just within the brain. More dependent upon what scientists and philosophers have described as the gradual acquisition of procedural learning, as contrasted with the conceptually articulatable declarative learning that we often so elevate in academic discourse. This way of seeing, as we learned yesterday, can give birth to novel ways of addressing how conflict might be transformed, facilitating interactive processes through, for example, workshops in which cooperative sense-making emerges more by interdependent coordinate activity than concepts and conversation. So at this point, let's allow conceptual mind to have a rest, at least briefly, and invite Richie Davidson to lead us in 5 minutes of meditation. Thank you.
Thank you, Al, and thank you all. So let's all find an upright posture, not too tight, not too loose. And let's bring our awareness into this present moment. And as we settle our minds and our bodies, let's invite this shift from our mode of doing to one of simply being. And as we, in our traditions, always begin a period of practice, however short, with reminding ourselves of our motivation. Why is it that we are all here? And let's see if we can find within ourselves the motivation and the conviction that nourishing our minds and our hearts in this way is beneficial not only for ourselves, but for all of those around us and for the precious earth that we inhabit. So let's spend a few moments steeping ourselves in this motivation. And now, let's bring into our minds and our hearts our purpose for being on this planet, for the work that we collectively do, for the interactions that we have. And let's remind ourselves of whatever it is that we take to be our guiding force. Our meaning, our values. Including the extraordinary opportunity that every one of us has been given in this precious human birth. let's allow this sense of appreciation for this opportunity. And we might even add responsibility that comes with this human life that we all share. And as we bring this very short period of practice to a close, let's end in the way we always end a session, however short, by dedicating whatever merit, whatever benefit we may have gleaned from these moments together for the benefit of all beings everywhere and for this sacred planet that we are privileged to inhabit. And let's see if we can infuse all of our discussions and dialogues as we go forward today with a sense of both appreciation and reverence. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to the day.
Thank you so much, Richie. Al, I'd love you to introduce Adam.
Thank you, Roshi. So we heard some yesterday about how important view is in the conduct of science, focusing particularly on what we call cognitive science. And we're very privileged this morning to be able to hear more about the importance of view in science, in this case, what we call physical science, from Adam Frank, who is professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Rochester, who will be speaking with us about doing science and being a subject. Adam.
Adam, great. I just want to mention one thing about Adam. He is not only an astrophysicist, but also a Zen practitioner. So, and a good friend and collaborator with Evan Thompson, our Evan. So thank you, Adam. I know you're in Portugal right now. I'm glad you're in your spaceship and are able to transport yourself efficiently everywhere.
Soon also, John Dunn and I will be co-pilots in playing video games together. So there's a whole new collaboration beginning, which we need not talk about now. Thank you. It is a pleasure to once again be part of this. This is, I think my first one was in 2018, and they, being part of the Varela Symposium has really opened my own thinking up in many powerful ways. So I thank you, Roshi, and Al, and everyone who's involved in this, because it's really been super helpful for me. So my talk today is on doing physics and being a subject. Before I start, I have to say I am a native New Yorker. I speak quickly. I will do my best to slow down. Also, sometimes because I'm a native New Yorker, I can be profane. When I get excited, I curse. So hopefully I won't, but I just need to let you know that may happen. Okay, so I'm going to start where I almost always start with these talks, which is a quote from The Harmony of the Relative and the Absolute, one of my favorite Buddhist chants. It's chanted Buddhist pieces, which is, so it's about the relative and the absolute, which is, I think, for me, so many ways, or so much the focus of how to bring these dialogues that we're trying to have, to bring them to a focus. So here, this quote: "Each thing has its own intrinsic value and is related to everything else in function and position. Ordinary life fits the absolute as a box and its lid. The absolute works together with the relative like two arrows meeting in air." So I bring up this idea of the relative and the absolute because of the question of view, because particularly in Western science, or and particularly my science of physics, there is a way that the relative and the absolute have a very unbalanced perspective. And let me give you a little bit more about that. So in the Western perspective, this idea of the absolute and the relative very much comes from the fact that the Western perspective comes from the Abrahamic religious traditions and the Greek philosophical traditions. So I have this image here of the cave, Plato's cave, and Plato's Doctrine of Ideals, and Blake's image of God. And so for the West, the absolute, other adjectives for it are the eternal, the perfectly objective, the transcendent, the real or ideal, meaning, whether you're into realism or idealism, as a perfectly objective, already existing reality, the ontic or the ontological, and when it comes to religious practice, the divine. And in particular, what we're talking about here is the disembodied, right? It's very much in Plato's Doctrine of Ideals. It was the idea of a perfect reality that was just forms, perfect mathematical forms. Whereas the relative was always cast down, literally cast down. So in the West, the relative is the temporal, the subjective, the psychological, the epiphenomenal, which is really kind of an insult. It means like, it's not even real. Epistemological, it's only about knowledge, not really about reality. And fallen, it's literally it's the tradition of the angels being fallen or into the world. And it's the embodied, right? So very unbalanced, where the absolute is considered what's most important, and the relative is like, it's a bunch of crap, you just have to put up with it. Now in physics, this idea is very much present. So I always show this book. I love this book. This is an actual book called Science and Ultimate Reality. So just the fact that there could be a book that has this title sort of shows you, where our orientation is. And I went into physics because I wanted to know, who doesn't want to know ultimate reality, right? So from the physics point of view, there is an ultimate, fundamental, and basal, that's one of the words that's used, reality, the ground, the floor upon which everything else is built, including mind, and mind is way up there and it's not really that important. And it's the job of physics to find that ultimate reality. So what we're really interested here is the world without us. And this speaks very much to the dichotomy that was being spoken of yesterday with this, the atomized view of that science often gives, where, people don't even really exist. They're just very far downstream, and their individual views are really not that important. And so what we really hold for value is our concepts, our giant unembodied concepts. And that's what's given pride of place and privilege. But for myself and for Evan, he mentioned this yesterday, and for Marcelo Gleiser, we consider this to be part of this view, or a view I'm going to articulate, what we call the blind spot. And it's actually a mistake. It's a metaphysics that gets associated with science. It's not science itself, but it's the way, we've been taught to think about what science does. And it's about, there's a number of aspects here. It's about objective ontologies. It's about materialism. The only thing that exists in the world is matter. It's that everything can be reduced down to matter's most basic constituents. It's the reification of mathematical laws, treating the mathematics as being more real than reality. And the idea that experience is an epiphenomenon. There's nothing really going on in experience. It's just, we're all just meat computers, essentially. And what the blind spot does not see is that at the heart of science lies something which makes science possible. And that is, there's many words for it: direct experience, the raw experience that we have, lived experience. Presence is another word you can use for it. The inescapable, here-ness of being alive. Being is another word for it. The life world, if we want to think in terms of phenomenology. And really what all these words come down to is being an embodied, inactive subject, right? Not just being a disembodied mind floating around, but actually, having a life world that you're embedded in. And so this is something that the traditional view in science gets wrong, can't see. And so I want to talk first about how we got there and what its consequences are. And I'm going to relate this to quantum mechanics. And we're going to talk a little bit about quantum mechanics in this and how quantum mechanics may offer some routes away from this usual view, but it's going to be contentious. So, okay, first all I have to do is describe a little bit of physics to you. We're going to actually do some physics here, and hopefully I can make it clear to you. There's this thing called the state in physics. It's it is what physicists care about most. It is our holy of holies. The state in physics is basically position. If I have a particle, its position and its momentum. And momentum can be thought of as just as velocity. So the state is position, which we can write as x, and velocity, which is v. And we write them in this way, in this kind of paired xv. And that's everything we need to know in order to know the particle, basically. Maybe some other qualities, but basically these are the most important ones. And there are what we call dynamical equations, which tell us how the state changes. So the most important of these, we're going back to the beginning, was F equals ma, the equation hopefully that you learned in high school, force equals mass times acceleration. And without going into great detail, I just want to show you there are these equations. And what happens is that these equations break down into two equations, one which tells me how x changes in time, position changes in time because of velocity, but velocity changes in times because of the forces that are applied. So these equations, what they do, I start with a state, and these dynamical equations tell me how the state changes. And so what's important about that? Well, the dynamical equations allow me, if you can tell me the position now and the velocity now, I can tell you the position later and the velocity later forever. Okay. And if you give me a system of particles like the entire universe, and you tell me every position and every velocity, then that's it. That's all I need for the rest of time to be able to predict the future course of the universe. And this is why Laplace, when he was asked by Napoleon, where is God in your theory? And he said, "Sire, I have no need for that hypothesis." Right. That's where that idea came from. That we treat why physics gets its pride of place in the sciences, because it seems to have this ability through these amazing dynamical equations to be able to know everything about, once you give me the state now, I can tell you everything about all states in the future. So this is what happened is after Isaac Newton, and he formulates the first dynamical equation, we have what I call the rise of classical physics through the empire of dynamical equations. Now, these are just a bunch of other equations. You don't need to know them. But what's important to know is that we started with Newton, and then we went to higher and higher levels of abstraction in terms of our dynamical equations. There was Lagrangian mechanics, which was built off of Newton's equations, and then Hamiltonian mechanics. And the equations got ever more gossamer, ever more beautiful. And I will tell you, they are a thing to behold. If you're inclined in this direction, they are the most beautiful things you can think about or encounter. They are, I understand why everyone, wants to put these equations on a t-shirt, or why people thought they saw God, or the thing of God's, they were reading God's mind when they learned these equations. That's the way I have felt most of my life. I still sort of feel that in a certain way, but I now learn that's just a language that I might use, and that there's a deeper truth. So what did we get with classical physics, which goes up to about 1900? Well, what we got was prediction and control, right? So here's a celestial mechanics textbook. With classical physics, we were able to predict the motions of the planets out for thousands of years to exquisite accuracy. We could do amazing things, feats of engineering that never would have been possible build bridges like this. And with building bridges, this is also industry. We were able to create a incredibly productive economy, which also ended up, sort of driving climate change. And we also learned with classical physics how to kill people much more effectively, right? I mean, so that's what I mean about, control as well. There's a side of this, which also comes to the fact that you gained control over nature, and we used it for all the dark, despairing, desire-driven things that human beings had been doing forever. We just now got more, that we were able to get better at it. Now, what happened at the dawn of the 20th century was that with our equipment, we started to get better, and we started probing smaller and smaller domains of space and time. We started to actually get down to like a billionth of a meter or a billionth of a second in our explorations of physics. And what we found when we got down there was that everything was different. Right? Physics was really confronted with the need to change its ideas. Some of the foundational ideas, as we're going to see, of classical physics just didn't work anymore. So this is a picture of the Slovej conference. I think it was 1928. I'm not really sure exactly what date it was, but this is when, you know, all of these great physicists got together to try and figure out what was going on. And what had already happened, one of the things they were trying to deal with was that they had a new dynamical equation rather than Newton's laws or those other equations I showed you, called the Schrodinger equation. And again, I'm just showing it down there because I think it's beautiful. But there's this thing here called psi, and it's the new state. The new state is not like the old state. And we're going to go through this in some detail. And it really forced physicists to rethink how they went about doing physics in a way that we still don't understand. We still don't, and that's what a lot of this talk is going to be about. So, so it was still all about the state, but now the idea of what was behind the state. It wasn't just position and velocity anymore. It was going to be something strange, weird, that you could still use to make incredible predictions, but it was going to be very hard to understand what was behind these predictions. So again, I just want to note something as we talk about science and and how it works. You want to note here, there's only one. There's many human beings in this picture. Only one of them has a uterus, right? And I don't think there's anyone here, any people of color here, right? So it's important to note that, right? Because it's human beings who do science, right? And we certainly hope that the science itself, because of its nature, brings us closer to some kinds of truths. But we also have to note that the people who are doing stuff, if you don't have a huge fraction of the population doing it, certain questions aren't going to get answered or asked, perhaps. Okay, so quantum mechanics was incredibly successful, and it actually allowed us to go far deeper than we went with classical physics. And in particular, it gave us took us a lot closer to having basal structures. Remember those the structures upon which the entire universe is built. And for this is what's called the standard model of particle physics. And this is just a schematic of it. Basically, what we learn from using quantum mechanics is that the universe is made up of two kinds of matter, quarks and leptons, and four kinds of forces: the electromagnetic force, the strong force between nuclei in atoms, the weak force, and then gravity. And then also that the quarks and the leptons each come in 6 flavors or varieties. Beautiful, symmetrical. This is an incredible human achievement. Now, this is not the last word. We're still wondering what's below this, but this is the standard model is really an incredible triumph of the human intellect. But those weirdnesses in quantum mechanics were still there, and they were never answered. So okay, before we go forward, I just want to point out how the ideas of the blind spot get embodied in this classical physics plus quantum mechanics idea. First of all, objective ontologies. The entirety of this physics that we're talking about assumes that there's a world out there, it's independent of us, it has nothing to do with us, okay? It is this God's eye view, or a view from nowhere. It absolutely assumes that all that exists in the world is this material, these quarks and leptons, that's it. And that everything in the world reduces down to their behavior. If you understood the laws of quarks and leptons and the forces, you're done. Eventually you could explain everything from fishes to societies, no surprises in some sense. It also treats all of our equations as being real. They're in fact more real than the actual things that are built out of them. It's those like this is Plato's Doctrine of Ideals. It's those equations that are the forms, the ideal forms, that is nature's purest expression of being. And all of us, everything that gets incarnate through them is lesser. It's a corrupted form almost. And then again, through this experience, you're just a meat computer. You're just a bunch of quarks and atoms that have gotten, or quarks and leptons that have gotten together in a particular form. And one of the things that those forms does is think, but there's nothing special going on there. And experience itself is also nothing special. Okay, so now let's push back a little bit on this. So it was the philosopher and mathematician, really one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, Alfred Whitehead, who very early, even as quantum mechanics was just being born, already saw the problem. And he pointed out, he had a number of critiques, but two of his most potent was, first of all, the idea of the bifurcation of nature. He said, what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't split nature into two systems of reality. And for him, nature was, as he called it, the terminus of sense awareness. It was basically, you know, what sight and taste and touch and the entirety, don't even break them up into individual senses. It was the entirety of experience, what that touched, you know, what it responded to. And he said, you should not split that up into two systems of reality. You don't have physical nature, and which, i.e., and then on the other side, direct experience. You don't have primary qualities, which is the stuff physics gives you, and then these secondary qualities, which come later. So for him, as he said, the red of the sunset, the experience of the red of the sunset is just as real and just as important as whatever your description of, you know, wavelengths of photons and detectors in the eye. They're both equally important. They are both to be held. There's not the absolute up here and the relative down here, okay? He was against the hierarchy here. He wanted some way to embrace both as without a hierarchy. And also part of this, he gave the idea of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And so this was the idea of the error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. And we'll come back to this again, for Whitehead, the concrete was just given. Concrete was direct experience. It is the experience of being in the world, the embodied, enacting subject. That's just given. You can't explain that. The abstractions that science finds, those are potent. Those have a reality to them that we don't want to, you know, dismiss, because as we saw with classical physics and quantum mechanics, you can do amazing things with them. But the job of science and philosophy is to understand how the abstract arises out of the givenness of the concrete. Okay. All right. So that's, you know, we're starting with that critique of the classic view of science, which includes, you know, classical physics and includes the way, as we're going to see, a lot of people want to think about quantum mechanics. But what we're now going to see is why quantum mechanics offers us a way to think about this problem of the absolute and the relative in a different way. And Call actually may require bringing perspectives from Buddhism into it that are useful. And we'll see what we mean by that. So remember, in classical physics, we had the classical state, position and momentum, or position and velocity. And we have to remember, it can be known, the classical state can be known to infinite precision. The knowledge of that state is totally independent of making any measurements about it. It doesn't matter whether you measure it. In classical physics, that state exists by itself. And the knowledge of the states for separate systems are separable, right? If I have a system over here and a system over there, doesn't matter, they're not connected. As long as they're separated, they're not connected. And I can know their individual properties. Now, what about in quantum mechanics? Do we have the same three properties? No. You cannot know the quantum state to infinite precision. No, the knowledge of the state is not independent of the measurement of the state. And measurement, we're going to see, plays a role in actually, in somehow almost establishing the fact that the state has properties. And finally, also, no, systems are not going to be separable. So let's do a deeper dive into this. Okay, so we're now going to have a little introduction to the quantum state. So the quantum state is called phi. That's what this Greek letter, and or psi. Excuse me, psi. And psi is very different from the classical state of position and moment and velocity. So, for example, here's an example of a classical state. Position is like 6.257 meters from that wall over there, and its velocity is 110.78 kilometers per hour. And I can have as much precision as I want for that. So, it's two numbers that fully specify the position and the velocity. The quantum state is this weird thing which says, psi is like, well, I got one possibility plus another possibility plus a third possibility plus a fourth possibility. I have a bunch of different ways that the particle, let's talk about particles, the particle could be, and I need to take them all into account at the same time. That's kind of weird. So let's do a deeper dive into that. The way to see this, how weird this is to do the example of Schrodinger's cat, where you take a cat, put the cat in the box, you've got radioactive material. It's a quantum event when a radioactive decay happens. if the Geiger counter detects the radioactive decay, a vial of poison is broken and the cat, it releases the poison and the cat dies. And the idea in quantum mechanics is that before you open this box that you put this whole thing in, the cat will be both dead and alive. It'll be in what's called a superposition of two states, a dead state and a live state. So what does that even mean? Let's do a deeper dive into it by looking at the quantum state. So again, this is the equation, Schrodinger's equation. We don't really have to care about it. We just note that in there is this thing called psi. And for this problem, let's say I'm setting up this apparatus. How would I write down the quantum state? I would write it this way. Psi, the quantum state for this apparatus, is A times a piece that says the cat's alive plus B times a piece that says the cat's dead. These are each terms in my quantum state. And one represents the cat being alive. The other one represents the cat being dead. That's literally the way the math plays out. So there's my, representation of the alive cat. There's my representation of the dead cat. Here's what's crazy. Before I open the box, because my equation looks like this, right? It's got this plus that. The cat is both dead and alive. Because the equation has two parts on it, we interpret it as being the cat is both dead and alive, right? That's what superposition means. I have two terms in the equation. They're both there. It's only by opening the box that we say the wave function collapses, and I look and I either see the alive cat or the dead cat. So if I see the alive cat, the dead part, this part of the equation just disappears. We say it collapses, okay? Now that same, what are we talking about cats for, right? What's the actual physical circumstances? Imagine I have a box that's got a partition, and I've got two sides of it, and I put an electron in the box, and the electron can be on either side. The physics is can be on either side. So what it means is that my wave function, or my state function, my psi, looks like A times this part that says the electrons in the left side of the box, plus another part that says the electrons in the other side of the box. That's what it really means physically, okay? And then when I do a measurement, I send photons in to look for the electron, and then the measurement is what determines whether or not this part stays or that part stays. But it's only after doing the measurement that one of the parts has to go away. Before I make the measurement, both parts are there. They are both equally real, okay? Or at least we have to figure out how to interpret this equation. That's the problem. The physics gives us this equation. How are we supposed to think about this equation? Now, what are these A's and B's in here, right? What's going on with these A's and B's? What are they all about? Well, here's the interesting thing. In quantum mechanics, in this equation, A is related to the probability that when I open the box, I see the electron on one side, or when I open the box, I see a dead cat. B is related to the probability that when I open the box, I see the electron on the other side, or I open the box and I see a dead cat, right? So it's about probability. So all of a sudden, whoa, there was no probability, fundamental probability happening in classical physics, right? I should be able to know things to, anything to infinite precision, right? And now I'm stuck with this idea that events are probable. I can't say exactly what's going to happen. I can only say how, what's the probability? Oh, it's 50% gonna, the cat's going to be dead or alive, or 10% the cat's going to be dead, and 90% the cat's going to be alive, right? Why does quantum mechanics have this fundamental uncertainty baked into it? Okay, and that is really, the fundamental question we're going to have to answer. And as we're going to see when we get to the interpretation of quantum mechanics, I want to unpack a little bit more. We're going to see how probability plays kind of a really fundamental role in understanding a new way of looking at the world, a new way of looking at the world that is more in tune with the embodied and inactive perspective. Okay, so I showed you this. So this equation up here, right here, is the state, the quantum state. And I'm trying to just say, look, it's an equation, right? It's an equation. You got to do something with it. You got to interpret it, right? So what kind of questions? Now, let me also point out that, we are very good at manipulating these equations, these state equations. It's why I'm talking to you now through this computer, through the internet. It's because with quantum mechanics, even though as weird as this equation may be, in terms of turning the crank, of the machine, the mathematical machinery to predict what's going to happen when I try and build a transistor, it's the best theory we've ever developed. Okay, so we know how to work with the equations like this. We just don't know what they mean on some deep level. So, okay, here are the questions that come from it. All right, well, first of all, what is this state function with these many parts that are all supposed to exist at the same time? What is a measurement? Like, why should the measurement matter? Why does the universe care whether or not I open the box or not? I mean, either you should have something happening in the box one way or the other, and it doesn't matter whether I open it. That doesn't seem to be what quantum mechanics says. And okay, who's an observer, right? Is it any interaction with the world that makes a quantum measurement, or do you have to actually have someone, an agent, making, a measurement? And this really, then fundamentally here is, do things have properties at all, right? Does if, let's say, my quantum experiment was about objects, particles having a color, black or white, right? What we would think that, like, look, I got a particle, I either painted it black or I painted it white. It doesn't matter whether I look at it. But quantum mechanics raises the issue whether or not we should even think about things having properties in and of themselves, right? This is about kind of like, does the individual exist in and of itself? Okay, so does the world have properties, intrinsically? And then the same along these lines, is anything truly independent? Do we have to have some kind of, or should we be moving to some kind of relational, like Carlo Rovelli talks about, that everything, the only way we can talk about things is in relationship to other things. Okay, now, quantum mechanics and Buddhism. So there are these two books, the Dancing Woolly Masters and the Tao of Physics, which, were very influential back in the day. And I have to say, I hate them. I'm sorry. Somebody's read them. I actually read the Tao of Physics when I was when I was an undergraduate, and I loved it. I loved it because I loved the description of quantum mechanics, and I loved what they were saying about Buddhism. But as I got older and I learned more about quantum mechanics, I really saw how wrong these books were. And they're wrong, really profoundly wrong, for two reasons. And it's important for me to say this because in every other Varela symposium I've done, oftentimes quantum mechanics comes up, and oftentimes I'm like the party pooper saying, like, quantum mechanics is not the way to think about science and Buddhism. So here I am talking about science and Buddhism and quantum mechanics, but I want to be clear about how what I think is the right way to do this. So the problem with these books and this whole thing was that there was a claim that quantum physics validated Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist perspectives. And there's two gigantic problems with this, that the people who have problems with this, one, are physicists, and two, Buddhist scholars, right? We just had this amazing meeting in Berkeley between physicists, philosophers, and scholars of Buddhism. And the problem is, for the physicists, which interpretation of quantum mechanics are you accepting? As we're about to see, there's lots of interpretations, right? And then the other problem is, which school of Buddhism are you talking about? And these books both assumed like that there was only one way to look at quantum mechanics, and there was only one way to look at Buddhism. And so it was very myopic in some sense. And it also generated a lot of what I call quantum grooviness. Okay, so there was like Deepak Chopra's, all of his books. If you like Deepak Chopra, I hope you like him for other reasons other than quantum stuff, because this stuff, like, it's always like, Deepak, I'm coming for you, man. But it was just a lot of, this just doesn't make sense. There really is no quantum mechanics in this. There's nothing about really quantum mechanics. And then there's this movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? I don't know if you've ever seen it, but like when I watched it, I had to keep from throwing my popcorn at my friend had to restrain me. And then I just pulled this out because all I had to do was like type in quantum spirituality or something in Google, and I got 10,000 books. Quantum love, right? And I'm not saying there's not all this in active view. There's many ways to look at the world that have, show us how we're intertwined, but just don't bring quantum mechanics into it because it's got nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with that part. So that's my pushback on that. And so let's just talk about why, in particular, why like the Dancing Woolly Masters was wrong, is that there are many ways to interpret that equation, the equation for the quantum state I showed you. There's many ways to think about psi, that variable, or the quantum state. And here's a list of quantum interpretations: objective collapse, many worlds, hidden variables, relationism, the Copenhagen interpretation, quantum Bayesianism, which we're going to talk more about, etc. There's like, there's 1,000 quantum interpretations, and they say very different things. Like, for example, all of these are very ontologically oriented. They very much believe that the world is out there. It has nothing to do with you. Subjectivity, it's not important. The wave, which means for them that the state or the wave function, means the same thing. The state the quantum state is about the world. It has nothing to do with you. And then there's these other interpretations, which are more epistemologically oriented. And in that case, the wave function is about your knowledge of the world. And the problem is what the Dancing Woolly Masters, et cetera, did is they just focused on the Copenhagen interpretation. And they didn't even really have that really nailed down very well. But they just said like, oh yeah, that's quantum mechanics. That's what quantum mechanics says. And the point is, like if you take one of these other interpretations, let's take the many worlds up here, the many worlds interpretation has, basically there's nothing in Buddhism that it would agree with. Basically there they say every time a quantum event happens, the universe splits into parallel versions. So when in the Schrodinger's cat, basically when you open the box, universe splits into two parts, one with a dead cat, one with a live cat, all deterministic, all materialistic. There's nothing in there about subject at all. So there's a version of quantum mechanics that has nothing to do with, that would not be favorable to Buddhism at all. And of course, this leads to the multiverse, which is a whole other subject. But it's very popular in this idea of the multiverse and parallel universes. Very popular in fiction, but there's no science in it. Okay, so I just want to point out that something like the many worlds interpretation has all of the usual blind spot ideas in it. So you can't just use you can't just point to quantum mechanics as being you got to think as being friendly to Buddhism. But there is this idea, another interpretation, which is at least pointing in a different direction, that may be mined. If we bring Buddhist philosophy and enactive approaches, they may find some ways to talk to each other in a way that's mutually beneficial. The idea is not to say like, oh, look, this shows Buddhism is true, or this shows Enaction is true. It's just a way in which, there may be ways in which this dialogue is fruitful for both sides. So Cubism is this other interpretation of quantum mechanics. And it's a radical subjectivist version of quantum mechanics. And it has consequences for all of science. This is Chris Fuchs who came up with it. And what Cubism does is it takes the probabilities in quantum mechanics at face values. What it says that all probabilities are subjective. It's not like the world has probability distributions, it's that you have probability distributions. Probabilities are always about an agent who has beliefs about the world. And then when they encounter the world, they do an experiment in this case, their probabilities change, right? So here's the parable of the umbrella. You go somewhere, I'm in Lisbon, and I've been here for 5 days, and it's never rained. I think, it never rains in Lisbon. The probability of rain in Lisbon is very low. And then my friend sends me a picture from across, I haven't gone out yet, and he shows me that picture. And now I have to reassess my probabilities of the rain in Lisbon. It's like, oh, okay. I've changed my probabilities based on new information. This is the model that Cubism has about quantum mechanics and about all of science. Cubism begins with subjects acting on the world, right? You start off with some set of beliefs that come from your knowledge of physics. We call these priors. You perform an experiment, you act on the world, and then you update your beliefs, right? So it's not about the world existing out there independent of you. It's about a dialogue between you and the world. It's always a dialogue between you and the world, and you can never take yourself out of it. And then I communicate my results to others, right? That's an important part of this. I'm not just sitting in the lab alone. I am in a part of a community of learners, a community of language users, right? So yeah, there's no disembodied individual in this case. And so what's important about Cubism is how much it's not the blind spot. It takes experience, embodiment, and enaction seriously. There's no fantasy land, God's eye, perspectiveless perspective that's going on here. And so Cubism is just, it's one interpretation, but it's an interpretation that really sort of has built into it a different way of thinking, not just about quantum mechanics, but about science entirely. Now, many physicists hate Cubism. Why? Right? Well, first of all, they'll say, you're anti-science, this is not science. And then you explain to them like, no, we're still talking about the process of doing experiments and communicating results. And they'll say, yeah, well, you're a solipsist, or solipsist, which is, you're just talking about yourself in a bubble and there's no world out there. We're like, no, you have to communicate your results to other people. You couldn't even do the experiment without other people. And they say, then you're giving up on the dream of a perfectly objective reality. And you're like, that was a stupid dream anyway. And then they'll say, okay, fine, you just suck, right? That's really where the conversations often end. You know, because this really forces us, this perspective, to think about science and think about physics, which the dream was to be able to read God's mind, that you have to step back from that. I think you get something equally as cool, but you have to step back from that. So this again goes to Whitehead's idea that the job of philosophy or science is to explain the abstract, not the concrete. Quantum mechanics gives us these rules, this beautiful mathematical formalism, and our job is not to preserve it as being some kind of like ideal thing that exists independent of us, is to understand how we discovered it and why it works so well, right? So this is Michel Bitbol, who is a philosopher who I really respect, says, you know, what we're really finding with those beautiful equations is the structural residue of our interaction with the world. So if you want to really know what's going on with physics, what makes it so exciting is it's this possibility to take this raw experience, really probe it, like, you know, go into a laboratory, isolate everything you possibly can, and then begin to see more about what's really happening when the self and the world split into these two, right? Because that's what's happened to us. Somehow, as to be a subject means, you know, when we take the autopoietic view, there's this split that happens between the self and the world, but they always need each other, right? They're always, you can never perfectly separate them. And so physics is actually some kind of reminder or remainder. It's the structure of that split. So, you know, this actually, I love this diagram. This actually comes from an article about Cubism. And so here's two physicists working on this very complicated optics table. And so from the view of Cubism and the view of Bitbol, the state, the quantum state and its equations are telling you is not that you're like reaching out and affecting things, but what you're seeing is how the self and world parsed, right? They're not purely independent. They are constantly interacting. And these laws of probability that we get in quantum mechanics are sort of the remainder. They're the way you can actually see the threads that actually occurred in this pulling apart, but that still connect. So this is something that Chris Fuchs called the tingly bits. The quantum mechanics is the tingly bits, the part in our contact with the world that does remain constant for us as human beings. And I love the idea of the tingly bits. Just to touch on, so what this really means here, I'm not going to spend much time on here, is just that this is a different way of thinking about what physics is about and what all science is about. It's about epistemic agency. Epistemic agency, we are all, life, every form of life is an epistemic agent. It's a agent that can control has some control over their beliefs, meaning in their contact with the world, they are updating their beliefs. There is always a horizon, information horizon, though, that an epistemic agent lives in the middle of. So just like with the horizon, as I move around, the horizon moves with me, right? I can never get to the horizon. Epistemic agents are always using information about the world through networks to update their beliefs. There is some structure in that. That's what the science is, some invariant structure. But we have to recognize that we're always we're always in the middle of that horizon, or is standing at the center of that horizon. So the interesting question is, what would happen if you started asking physics questions from the attitude of being an epistemic agent? So you don't assume there's some pre-existing ontology, some God's eye view, but you start asking about how the world comes into view for you as an epistemic agent. So again, I'm not going to go too much in this, just this self-world dichotomy. And self-world is also relative and absolute. Start to harmonize those, or at least make it horizontal rather than vertical. So to go beyond the blind spot, what we're looking for is to go beyond to find the residue of the parsing of subject and object, or observer and world. And that residue is the tingly bits. And that's what you want to explain. If you could explain that, you can do away with this idea of like, I have to read God's thoughts. No, explain this incredible thing that happens with subject and object, where the world comes into being and the self comes into being, and they need each other. And maybe there's many ways to do that. That's what I find really interesting, right? Because I do a lot of work on aliens. I actually do a lot of work on what are called technosignatures. And so maybe there's a lot of ways to do that. And so that's why I love this movie, Arrival. If you've ever seen it, it's a fantastic movie about a first contact with aliens. And the interesting thing about this was they had a kind of a Carl Sagan character in it, who was a scientist who was going to talk to the aliens by showing them math, and we were going to use math as a language. It didn't work at all. Instead, they had to have a linguist who understood what language was all about, and it was the linguist who was able to make contact with the aliens. And the aliens, because of their language, had a totally different experience of time. Their physics was different because the way they had parsed, through their temporality, I mean, their evolution had separated, they'd gotten a different kind of physics. And I just thought that's really interesting. Maybe it's, on some sense, I'm going to put this in quotes, biology comes before physics in some weird way. That's wild speculation, by the way. Okay, so just to conclude, remember that we physicists think that the whole point is to understand the world without us, right? And what I'm going to say is the way I would take what we've learned, perhaps learn from quantum mechanics, is yeah, sure, of course there's a world without us, right? It wouldn't make sense to say there's no world out there. It's just not this one. The world we live in is the human world, is the world that's been parsed into subject and object in a particular way. And that's what we're given, and that's what we have to understand. So I will end with my favorite quote of all time by the poet Muriel Rukeyser: "The universe is made of stories, not atoms." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. Mind expanding as always. We have a short time for some observations and discussion from Amy.
Thank you, Al. Wow, Adam. It's awesome.
Hopefully
I'm glad that I had the slides before your talk. Not that they helped that much, but a little bit. I was first thinking about your title on doing physics and being a subject, and I was thinking maybe I would have written on being a physicist and being a subject, or something like that, because it corresponds a little bit better to your notion of the primacy of subjectivity, what you've been, I think, telling us about. Please correct me if I'm wrong. The primacy of subjective experience in the doing of physics, and above all, fascinatingly, in the multiplicity of interpretations of quantum mechanics. But this doing also evokes for me the sense that you convey very well that this is really a work in progress. And that as our conception of matter has changed so much over a couple of centuries, that this could all continue changing pretty radically in the future. So there's a kind of a groundlessness to physics that you really evoke beautifully. And if I may, I'd mention that on the slide deck you sent me, there wasn't this title. There was another title that was very intriguing for me. It was Quantum Living, which evoked for me a little bit the discussions we had yesterday about inaction. Is it a practice? Is it a view? Is it? So I won't ask you this as a question. I do have a couple of questions that I hope that are somewhat meaningful. But it's an interesting idea. Is there like a quantum way of life? What does it do to you? What is it like to be a quantum physicist and not a bat, or not a normal person for that matter? I also couldn't help but think while I was listening to you that I imagined physicists must start their studies in physics by thinking they're going to get to this basal point and then undergo a kind of a shock when they realize that physics is like the least basal thing one could possibly imagine in a way. And it's kind of like going through a mirror when you describe to us the transformation between classical physics and these different interpretations of quantum physics, and don't tell us which one is right. So as you could probably tell, I'm really beginner's mind as far as this is concerned, but I did, looking through your and listening to you above all, I did have a question because I did a teeny weeny bit of homework. So one of my questions has to do with these tingly bits, which, you know, obviously it has to. And so I did do homework that you kindly gave to me. And I wanted to give you a quote that really intrigued me from Fuchs, who I take to be the father of Cubism. And he says, so I'm reading this, concerning measurement, he says, quote, "The outcomes of measurements are experiences, not revelations of something that's already out there." Mm. And I'm wondering if you could comment on this notion of a measurement as the outcome of a measurement as an experience, and if you could possibly relate it, as I kind of did in my own vague way, to the kind of relationality that Varela talks about and that Michel Bitbol talks about, that characterizes the enaction, the enactive perspective on organism and mind and their interactions. So it's measurement as experience that intrigued me.
Yeah, I think this is what I love talking with Chris. I think he's one of the most creative thinkers around, and that's why you know, the Cubism is not just about physics, it's about all of science, because what he's saying is that the outcome of a measurement is not a number that floats in some ethereal, you know, realm that always existed, that, you know, that the outcome would always have been like that. God already knew what the outcome was going to be and had that number in his or her head. Instead, you know, the outcome of an experiment is like anything else. We are alive. We are part of this matrix of life, whether it's society or whether it's I'm walking through a forest. You know, we're in this matrix of the living world that we're part of. And even when we're in the lab doing this like hyper complicated, you know, experiment, you know, opening the box or, you know, getting the readout is like looking at a leaf, is like, you know, is having, you know, your child getting a hug from your child. It's just another experience. It shouldn't be elevated into like this platonic realm where something special happened in that measurement. And so so what it means, that's why it changes science so much. It says that, you know, science is just a very particular form of life, is of doing anything. It's like cooking, it's like anything else. It's just that what we've learned with science is how to remove the other, you know, or we've been able to isolate certain aspects about it to be able, this is what Michel calls the structural invariance. So in making the measurement and having it be an experience, what you can, through this process with lots of other people, you can begin to see what is invariant in that particular experience, which then relates to all of being alive. Mm-hmm. Is that helpful?
And it is helpful and relates to communication.
Exactly.
So and that sort of anti-solipsism argument.
And to view.
And to view.
Right. Right. It's always someone who is doing the experiment. Experiments don't happen, you know, in a void. They're part of a community of learners that are doing the experiment at a particular moment in history. They're embedded in their history. They're embedded in their communities. And so there's no way of escaping. You never get that perspectiveless perspective.
Right. It just occurs to me as I'm listening to you that, I don't know if you know, but in French, the word for experience and the word for experiment are the same word.
Oh.
And it's expérience. So
yeah. Yeah.
That's for Genevieve too. Thank you, Genevieve. This actually, what your responses takes me, you kind of responded to my second question, which I noted down, that refers to the blind spot, and where you talk about this process of eviction of subjectivity or subjective experience from a physics or from science that puts us at a distance from the world and makes it into something that's outside of us. And I think in the article you say that to see the blind spot is to recognize the place of that the perceiving subject is prior to the very cut between inside and outside. So it's pre-reflexive or non-dualist. And I think you were referring to Whitehead's bifurcation. That might probably relates to that too. Gabor would certainly know something about that. and therefore it's primary. So I have another quote here, seeing the blind spot, and you talked a bit about what it means to see this blind spot of subjectivity in science means, and now I'm quoting, embracing the hope that we can create a new scientific culture in which we see ourselves both as expressions of nature and as a source of nature's self-understanding. We need nothing less than a science nourished by this sensibility for humanity to flourish in the new millennium. So I thought that this might be a good place to also to, if people want to have questions and talk. It's a beautiful quote. You kind of answered it already. Maybe you have some more to say about the political side of science and this articulation between what physics has shown us about subjectivity, or what this aspect of physics confirms to us about subjectivity and inaction.
Well, you know, it's funny because so this is very much the you know, Evan and Marcelo's and our book, The Blind Spot, this is, you know, in many ways we're trying to articulate this in physics, we're trying to articulate this or how it manifests in physics, how it manifests in biology, in cognitive science, and consciousness studies. Because for us, the blind spot is sort of, as we say, it's a metaphysics which has been pinned on to science, but really isn't science. Science is this process of all of us working together, doing experiments, communicating, or that's communicating results. Something is science is objective, not because it speaks about the objective reality, right? God's eye view. It's objective because I do the experiment and you do the experiment, and we both get, if we get the same result, we can talk about it. So what we, you know, the blind spot, which was, you know, this metaphysics of control, you know, this metaphysics of that really puts life and mind way down, right? Where, you know, from the blind spot view, all of us are just robots. We're just robots controlled by our genes, essentially. And that's a story, right? That is not what science says. That's a story that, you know, for certain group, if you're metaphysically disposed to that, you'll say, oh, that's what science says. But there's other stories that you can tell about science. And the problem is, as we try to show in the last chapter of the book, that story also underpinned the rise of a certain level of political economy, right? The political economy that underpinned not just capitalism, but also the socialist economies as well. The idea of extraction, you know, of resource extraction, of just, you know, colonialism. Didn't matter whether, you know, whose colonialism it was, that, you know, it was a view of the world that the world was dead, right? People liked, the people who are advocates of the blind spot, they like it because it gives them a hermetically sealed, perfectly understandable God's eye view. But it's so hermetically sealed that it chokes off life. And so there's no ways, I think, that we're going to be able to make the transformations that we need to make in order to, you know, have a sustainable civilization, you know, with you know, 7 billion people on the planet without this shift. Because science is so important to us that it plays such a role in the society we've created, that we need a kind of science that recognizes the primacy of experience and the primacy of life, or else we're just going to keep doing the same kind of, you know, mistakes that we've made before.
So Adam, I want to thank you. We have to conclude, but only to say this view that you're proposing right now, I think, is actually at the core of why we're exploring inaction over these 2 days so intensively. And I thank you, Amy, for jumping in the way that you have to ask the really hard questions. And Adam, this was brilliant. And we will return at 20 after the hour for meeting Abiba Birdhane and this exploration of artificial intelligence in relation to complex adaptive systems and inaction. So thank you so much, Adam. Amy, thank you.